Hello, it's me, Dr. Ra-Tease, from the Institute of Integral Occultism. We at the Institute have dedicated ourselves to understanding the occult with as much academic rigor as the mystics lose when losing themselves in the awe of profound mystery. We try not to be reductive of either academic or mythical approaches, recognizing that complex objective systems may give rise to the beautiful simplicity we appreciate subjectively as art. However, with academic rigor comes integral thinking, and this brings me to the central theme of today's discussion. The Emoji-Goetia connection postulated by Professor Bulwer Smythe. The Goetia is a magical grimoire which is said to have been written by the mythical King Solomon. The grimoire depicts 72 seals which represent 72 demonic entities and outlines a method by which they may be summoned. Professor Bulwer Smythe has noticed a series of interesting correlations between the 72 seals of the Goetia and the 72 emojis that we may be familiar with from any standard text chat, some of which are shaped, well, almost similarly. The Emoji-Goetia connection may be an astute series of correlations made by a mind that is clearly capable of pattern recognition, but correlation does not equal causation. Whilst it is exactly this kind of inquiry that leads us to the kind of brilliant and interesting discoveries so often overlooked by stuffy academics, there may be grave dangers when mistaking a few correlating patterns for causations. And a little bit of knowledge can be more dangerous when it forms a shallow representation of the truth than none at all. Here, let me explain. Whilst people might have particular mystical or occult experiences, the way those experiences may be interpreted after the experience can vary quite dramatically. These interpretations depend on the kind of value system you have. The spiral dynamics model identifies a series of value systems, or value memes, and explains how they arise. I will explore developmental models relative to the occult more deeply in future, so be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out. In the meantime, here's a brief overview. The first tier starts off with beige. Think how babies have hardly any cognitive complexity. Purple then inherits information at face value and is rather animistic, a kind of tribal mythic literal identity that doesn't question information received much. Then we have the egocentric red stage. This might be noticeable as emerging during the terrible twos. Picture a child knocking a bowl of cereal off his high chair and laughing maniacally at his mother's frustration. A kind of selfish, solipsistic gangster mentality for those who are unable to grow out of it. Guilt would then be a catalyst for the more group-centric or ethnocentric stage blue to develop. Stage blue thinks in absolutes and tends to be quite dogmatic in thinking, often religious. Good and evil are believed to be actual forces that exist in the world, rather than simply deficiencies, surpluses, or imbalances. So far, we have developed from pre-rational to basic rationality at blue. Rationality improves again at the more scientific orange stage, who tends to be very reductive and analytical in thought. The orange stage is more individualistic and entrepreneurial. Think modern rational science-driven capitalism. The more sensitive green stage is the leading edge of the first tier. It finally becomes more world-centric, recognizing the importance of the environment and good social relationships. It is more relative and postmodern, recognizing the labels by which we interpret things. Green values egalitarianism and harm reduction, especially when ecology is concerned. It tends to reject hierarchies and labels that it considers problematic. All the stages of the first tier transcend and reject prior stages. The second tier then transcends and includes them. Stage yellow recognizes all prior stages as having been integral stages of its development, all having uses in different scenarios. It recognizes that people will inevitably express these different values at different points in their developmental trajectory. Whereas the green postmodernists were quick to reject many labels from pre-modern and modern stages, the yellow stage transcends linguistic structures without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Yellow recognizes the relativity of these structures without arbitrarily deconstructing everything based on its preferences, and does so while seeing through the illusion of modern essentialism. These post-postmodern, or metamodern, stages of the second tier become capable of reincorporating the mythical animistic thinking of the first tier for the purposes of immersive experience and insight into the nature of being. Spirits may be constructed by invocation, evocation, and banished by deconstruction. Each of these stages will clearly have a different capacity to interpret and understand occult phenomena or mystical experiences. Now, returning to the Emoji-Goetia connection. There are 72 seals and 72 emojis. Coincidence? Well, aside from the 72 Goetic demons, there are also the 72 angels of the Shem HaMephorash. Both angels or demons may be represented as archetypes. Carl Jung described archetypes as an explanatory paraphrase of the Platonic eidos. In John Vervaeke's excellent series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, he establishes that the Platonic eidos is the structural functional organization. This is the form of a thing, an organization that is identifiable as a functioning expression of the sum of its parts. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition identifies spirits as tulpas, or thought forms. Picture a kid pretending to be Batman and getting lost in a hyperreality of that character. This is an example of invocation. Sometimes the child may be completely immersed in the act of roleplay, like sword fighting with an enemy that has been evoked in the air before your mind's eye. When we look at the demons evoked in Goetia from a theological perspective, or theological Christian perspective, we may end up with a kind of black and white, heaven and hell full of angels and demons, being translated through the highly superstitious interpretations of antiquity. If we go deeper into an orthodox psychological interpretation, we find that demons aren't just going to be evil archetypes. Any being that's capable of teaching ethics is going to have some range of a moral compass. I mean, Goetic demon Stolas teaches astronomy and the uses of herbs. We can identify angels or demons as expressions of whatever qualities they are said to represent. Of course, what we may call demonic qualities in humans are typically expressions of that which is unconscious within us. For example, when we're tired or hungry, we may be debilitated and more prone to irritants or anger. When we feel afraid or threatened, we may be more prone to violence or manipulative behaviors. When we are ashamed, jealous, or offended, we may be more likely to project that onto others, so we end up dehumanizing or belittling them instead of dealing with our own feelings of inadequacy. Obviously, archetypal characters or thought forms may depict any combination of character qualities. Whether or not they represent more conscious, unconscious, angelic, or demonic entities, we conjure in mind these imaginary representations of certain qualities. Jung himself confirmed that the archetypes of the collective unconscious, those structural functional organizations, they could possess people so that they'd act in a blind, instinctual way, as if under a spell, or hyperreality where the symbolic has been mistaken for the real. By now we may recognize that these angelic or demonic characters are identifiable as aspects of the psyche, which we can interact with during thought, dreams, or visualization and such, etc. Now, if we were to examine the interpretation of such through the lens of the spiral dynamics model, we might find a series of very different interpretations. Purple and blue might have more mythic literal interpretations. Orange might be reductive of archetypes as only perennial patterns or ideas. Green may tell you that they are only imaginary and deconstruct them. Yellow onwards may express a synthesis of all of these perspectives, embracing the magical thinking of the mythic literal stages from a more systemic and nuanced position. Whilst the Emoji-Goetia connection is an interesting correlation based on the numbers, I can't help but debunk it. From the perspective of structural linguistics, the Goetic seals would have been drawn and then associated with the imaginative qualities that they were intended to represent. There's nothing essentially representative about those patterns. Essentialism is mythic literal. You would have to first know about the Goetia, remember all of the seals, understand what they all represent, and then associate them with the emojis for that to be of any consequence whatsoever. So the idea is more likely to affect those who believe that there's a connection between emojis and demons than it would anyone else. Even if some group of people had a kind of animistic, essentialist, mythic literal interpretation of the seals, and decided to associate them with the emojis, that would only affect them. This would only be practical for activating some kind of imaginary symbolic hyper-reality relative to the Goetia, which in Goetic magic is largely useful for attributing an archetypal character to the more primal, base, or negative aspects of the human psyche for the purposes of interaction. Whilst some mythic literal practitioners may get some kind of result from subduing those aspects of the unconscious's symbolic order, or delegating it a task, the emojis would only be a personal stand-in to the person who associated the idea with them. By the logic of assuming any inherent relation, all images of a smiley face, or laughing face, or whatever, would become Goetic seals. So imagining this to be true is arguably of more consequence than anything else. Professor Bulwer Smythe argued that this view of angels and demons as archetypal originated with Crowley. However, one of the four worlds in Hermetic Kabbalah is that of the archetypal realm, which precedes him. Crowley and his secretary, psychologist Dr. Israel Regardie, might align with this view, but they are not the progenitors of it. Whilst I share their positions as true but partial, my perspective has been reinforced by integrally combining psychological study and occult practice over many years. I'm not trying to use structural linguistics to flatten the idea of mythical worlds like a trigger-happy postmodernist. The mythic literal part is an important aspect of the magical hyperreality, but it is an oversight to ignore the structure of such hyperrealities. What is it that structures and orders the astral forms evoked? You may not need structural linguistics for the practice of Goetia, but it is integral to understanding how evocation works, and how the results are interpreted. I will release a more in-depth video about that in the future. Hopefully you can begin to see how an understanding of developmental systems, such as the spiral dynamics model, really helps to clarify the different angles by which we can understand differing qualities of the same phenomenon. In the key to Solomon's Key, Lon Milo Duquette, as an experienced Goetic practitioner, Mason, and member of the OTO, confirms there's no actual evidence as to whether or not King David or King Solomon even existed. But they remain excellent for magical allegories. Longtime Goetia practitioner Poke Runyon also has the holistic archetypal approach, as is alluded to in the theology shared at Angela's Symposium. Runyon also explains how the old Babylonian gods, or jinn perhaps, were demonized into what we now consider as the Goetic spirits. Bulwer Smythe argues that the Goetic symbols were inherited and that the psychological view of this was rejected by Kenneth Grant in the Encyclopedia Goetica. With respect to the work of Grant, this is an argument for because the book says so, a mythic literal position. Whilst I appreciate that the psychologization of magical practices can be distasteful to some, who may want to preserve their mythical biases, to ignore the effects of the relevant psychological operations taking place during the ritual process is, well, silly. Specifically when it comes to analysis. Of course, getting immersed in a mythical hyperreal psychodrama is half of the fun in practice. Whilst these kind of views are great for immersive and engaging magical experiences, they are not so great for rationally understanding the causal chain of a system. There's no evidence to suggest that the Goetia was inherited, and even if it was inherited and those seals were drawn by a person. We know psychologically that people may receive information from the symbolic order of the unconscious. By the very fact that the seals were written down by hand at some point, you'd be hard-pressed to prove that they weren't. Because the book said so just doesn't cut the mustard. The scholarly study of such arts is not an excuse to reject causality, like the practice of them may sometimes be. The Emoji-Goetia connection is an example of correlation, not causation. I very much appreciate the value of the Emoji-Goetia connection as a draw to Bulwer Smythe's channel, which I believe is now selling Emoji-Goetia related merchandise. That's one reason I can think of as to why he would rather peddle these ideas than accept they are fictitious. I do have certain ethical issues with aspects of Goetic evocation, namely bullying vestigial or primitive aspects of the unconscious, which may have detrimental effects on the psyche, such as reinforcement of repression, valencing emotions, and the unfortunate conditioning of superficial fair-weather friends. However, the larger issue lies with how the mythic literal brigade are already dribbling and snarling in an effort to point the finger at the next imaginary emoji archon. And it's no secret that group-centric Stage Blue loves a witch hunt. Emojis might have the unfortunate effect of trivializing emotional expressions, perhaps leading to the confusion of genuine expressions of emotion with the idea of them, thus complicating conditions such as autism. Like most things, in some sense, emojis may come with certain issues, but if you believe that a picture of a smiley face used to signify happiness is inherently demonic, I sincerely suggest checking your capacity for reason, questioning what you're told, and learning to differentiate between correlation and causation. Well, thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for more content down the line. This has been Dr. Ra-Tease at the Institute of Integral Occultism, now signing off.